Raucous laughter broke out on the other side of the low wall dividing the room, and a scornful voice spoke up loudly. "Trollocs! Put on a gleeman's cloak, man. You're drunk. Trollocs! Borderland fables." The words doused anger like a pot of cold water. Even Matt half turned to the wall, eyes widening. Rand stood just enough to see over the wall, then ducked back down again with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Florin Gelb sat on the other side of the wall, at the table in the back, with the two men who had been there when they came in. They were laughing at him, but they were listening. Barnum was wiping a table that badly needed it, not looking at Gelb and the two men. But he was listening too, scrubbing one spot over and over with his towel, and leaning toward them until he seemed almost ready to fall over. "Gelb," Rand whispered as he dropped back into his chair, and the others tensed. Tom swiftly studied their side of the room. On the other side of the wall, the second man's voice chimed in. No, there used to be Trollocs, but they killed them all in the Trolloc Wars." "Borderland fables," the first man repeated. "It's true, I tell you," Gelb protested loudly. "I've been in the borderlands. I've seen Trollocs, and these were Trollocs as sure as I'm sitting here. Those three claimed the Trollocs were chasing them, but I know better. That's why I wouldn't stay on the spray. I've had my suspicions about Baal Doman for some time, but those three are dark friends for sure. I tell you—" Laughter and coarse jokes drowned out the rest of what Gelb had to say. How long, Rand wondered, before the innkeeper heard a description of those three? If he had not already. If he did not just leap to the three strangers he had already seen. The only door from their half of the common room would take them right past Gelb's table. "Maybe the boat isn't such a bad idea," Matt muttered, but Tom shook his head. "Not anymore." The gleeman spoke softly and fast. He pulled out the leather purse Captain Doman had given him and hastily divided the money into 3 piles. "That story will be all through the town in an hour, whether anybody believes it or not, and the halfman could hear any time. Doman isn't sailing until tomorrow morning. At best he'll have Trollocs chasing him all the way to Ilion. Well, he's half expecting it for some reason, but that won't do us any good. There's nothing for it but to run, and run hard." Matt quickly stuffed the coins Tom shoved in front of him into his pocket. Rand picked his pile up more slowly. The coin Moraine had given him was not among them. Doman had given an equal weight of silver, but Rand, for some reason he could not fathom, wished he had the Aes Sedai's coin instead. Stuffing the money in his pocket, he looked a question at the gleeman. "In case we're separated," Tom explained. "We probably won't be, but if it does happen, well, you two will make out all right by yourselves. You're good lads. Just keep clear of Aes Sedai. For your lives." "I thought you were staying with us." "I am, boy, I am. But they're getting close now, and the light only knows. Well, no matter. It isn't likely anything will happen." Tom paused, looking at Matt. "I hope you no longer mind me staying with you," he said dryly. Matt shrugged. He eyed each of them, then shrugged again. "I'm just on edge. I can't seem to get rid of it. Every time we stop for a breath, they're there, hunting us. I feel like somebody's staring at the back of my head all the time. What are we going to do?" The laughter erupted on the other side of the wall, broken again by Gelb trying loudly to convince the two men that he was telling the truth. How much longer, Rand wondered. Sooner or later, Bartram had to put together Gelb's 3 and the 3 of them. Tom eased his chair and rose, but kept his height crouched. No one looking casually toward the wall from the other side could see him. He motioned for them to follow, whispering, "Be very quiet." The windows on either side of the fireplace, on their side of the wall, looked out into an alleyway. Tom studied one of the windows carefully before drawing it up just enough for them to squeeze through. It barely made a sound, nothing that could have been heard 3 feet away over the laughing argument on the other side of the low wall. Once in the alley, Matt started for the street right away, but Tom caught his arm. "Not so fast," the gleeman told him. "Not till we know what we're doing." Tom lowered the window again, as much as he could from outside, and turned to study the alley. Rand followed Tom's eyes. Except for 6 rain barrels against the inn and the next building, a tailor shop, the alley was empty, the hard-packed dirt dry and dusty. "Why are you doing this?" Matt demanded again. "You'd be safer if you left us. Why are you staying with us?" Tom stared at him for a long moment. "I had a nephew, Owen," he said wearily, shrugging out of his cloak. He made a pile of his blanket roll as he talked, carefully setting his cased instruments on top. "My brother's only son, my only living kin. He got in trouble with the Aes Sedai, but I was too busy with other things. I don't know what I could have done, but when I finally tried, it was too late. Owen died a few years later. You could say Aes Sedai killed him." He straightened up, not looking at them. His voice was still level, but Rand glimpsed tears in his eyes as he turned his head away. "If I can keep you two free of Tar Valon, maybe I can stop thinking about Owen. Wait here." Still avoiding their eyes, he hurried to the mouth of the alley, slowing before he reached it. After one quick look around, he strolled casually into the street and out of sight. Matt half rose to follow, then settled back. "He won't leave these," he said, touching the leather instrument cases. "You believe that story?" Rand squatted patiently beside the rain barrels. "What's the matter with you, Matt? You aren't like this. I haven't heard you laugh in days." "I don't like being hunted like a rabbit," Matt snapped. He sighed, letting his head fall back against the brick wall of the inn. Even like that, he seemed tense. His eyes shifted warily. "Sorry. It's the running, and all these strangers, and just everything. It makes me jumpy. I look at somebody and I can't help wondering if he's going to tell the Fades about us, or cheat us, or rob us, or... Light, Rand, doesn't it make you nervous?" Rand laughed, a quick bark in the back of his throat. "I'm too scared to be nervous." "What do you think the Aes Sedai did to his nephew?" "I don't know," Rand said uneasily. There was only one kind of trouble that he knew of for a man to get into with Aes Sedai. Not like us, I guess. No, not like us. For a time they leaned against the wall, not talking. Rand was not sure how long they waited. A few minutes, probably, but it felt like an hour waiting for Tom to come back, waiting for Bartim and Gelb to open the window and denounce them for dark friends. Then a man turned in at the mouth of the alley, a tall man with the hood of his cloak pulled up to hide his face. A cloak black as night against the light of the street. Rand scrambled to his feet, one hand wrapped around the hilt of Tam's sword so hard that his knuckles hurt. His mouth went dry and no amount of swallowing helped. Matt rose to a crouch with one hand under his cloak. The man came closer, and Rand's throat grew tighter with every step. Abruptly, the man stopped and tossed back his cowl. Rand's knees almost gave way. It was Tom. "Well, if you don't recognize me," the Gleeman grinned, "I guess it's a good enough disguise for the gates." Tom pushed past them and began transferring things from his patch-covered cloak to his new one so nimbly that Rand could not make out any of them. The new cloak was dark brown, Rand saw now. He drew a deep, ragged breath. His throat still felt as if it were clutched in a fist. Brown, not black. Matt still had his hand under his cloak, and he stared at Tom's back as if he were thinking of using the hidden dagger. Tom glanced up at them, then gave them a sharper look. "This is no time to get skittish." Deftly he began folding his old cloak into a bundle around his instrument cases, inside out so the patches were hidden. "We'll walk out of here one at a time, just close enough to keep each other in sight. Shouldn't be remembered especially that way. Can't you slouch?" he added to Rand. "That height of yours is as bad as a banner." He slung the bundle across his back and stood, drawing his hood back up. He looked nothing like a white-haired gleeman. He was just another traveler, a man too poor to afford a horse, much less a carriage. "Let's go. We've wasted too much time already." Rand agreed fervently, but even so he hesitated before stepping out of the alley into the square. None of the sparse scattering of people gave them a second look. Most did not look at them at all. But his shoulders knotted, waiting for the cry of dark friend that could turn ordinary people into a mob bent on murder. He ran his eyes across the open area, over people moving about on their daily business, and when he brought them back, a myrddraal was halfway across the square. Where the fate had come from, he could not begin to guess, but it strode toward the three of them with a slow deadliness, a predator with the prey under its gaze. People shied away from the black-cloaked shape, avoided looking at it. The square began to empty out as people decided they were needed elsewhere. The black cowl froze Rand where he stood. He tried to summon up the void, but it was like fumbling after smoke. The Fade's hidden gaze knifed to his bones and turned his marrow to icicles. "Don't look at its face," Tom muttered. His voice shook and cracked, and it sounded as if he were forcing the words out. "The light burn you, don't look at its face." Rand tore his eyes away. He almost groaned. It felt like tearing a leech off of his face. But even staring at the stones of the square, he could still see the myrddraal coming. A cat playing with mice, amused at their feeble efforts to escape, until finally the jaws snapped shut. The Fade had halved the distance. "Are we just going to stand here?" he mumbled. "We have to run, get away." But he could not make his feet move. Matt had the ruby-hilted dagger out at last in a trembling hand. His lips were drawn back from his teeth, a snarl, and a rictus of fear. "Think," Tom stopped to swallow, and went on hoarsely. "Think you can outrun it, do you, boy?" He began to mutter to himself. The only word Rand could make out was Owen. Abruptly, Tom growled. "I never should have gotten mixed up with you boys. Should never have." He shrugged the bundled Gleeman's cloak off of his back and thrust it into Rand's arms. "Take care of that. When I say run, you run and don't stop until you get to Camelin. The Queen's blessing, and in. Remember that, in case... Just remember it." "I don't understand," Rand said. The myrddraal was not 20 paces away now. His feet felt like lead weights. "Just remember it," Tom snarled. "The Queen's blessing. Now. Run!" He gave them a push, one hand on the shoulder of each of them, to get them started, and Rand stumbled away in a lurching run with Matt at his side. "Run!" Tom sprang into motion, too, with a long, wordless roar. Not after them, but toward the myrddraal. His hands flourished as if he were performing at his best, and daggers appeared. Rand stopped, but Matt pulled him along. The Fade was just as startled. Its leisurely pace faltered in mid-stride. Its hand swept toward the hilt of the black sword hanging at its waist, but the Gleeman's long legs covered the distance quickly. Tom crashed into the myrddraal before the black blade was half drawn, and both went down in a thrashing heap. The few people still in the square fled. "Run!" The air in the square flashed an eye-searing blue, and Tom began to scream, but in the middle of the scream he managed a word. "Run!" Rand obeyed. The Gleeman's screams pursued him. Clutching Tom's bundle to his chest, he ran as hard as he could. Panic spread from the square out through the town as Rand and Matt fled on the crest of a wave of fear. Shopkeepers abandoned their goods as the boys passed. Shutters banged down over storefronts, and frightened faces appeared in the windows of houses, then vanished. People who had not been close enough to see ran through the streets wildly, paying no heed. They bumped into one another, and those who were knocked down scrambled to their feet or were trampled. Whitebridge roiled like a kicked anthill. As he and Matt pounded toward the gates, Rand abruptly remembered what Tom had said about his height. Without slowing down, he crouched as best he could without looking as if he were crouching. But the gates themselves, thick wood bound with black iron straps, stood open. The two gate tenders in steel caps and mail tunics worn over cheap-looking red coats with white collars fingered their halberds and stared uneasily into the town. One of them glanced at Rand and Matt, but they were not the only ones running out of the gates. A steady stream boiled through, panting men clutching wives, weeping women carrying babes and dragging crying children, pale-faced craftsmen still in their aprons, still heedlessly gripping their tools. There would be no one who could tell which way they had gone, Rand thought as he ran, dazed. "Tom. Oh, light save me, Tom,"